this video, we'll give you 6 wide receivers we dislike in 2024 fantasy redraft leagues. I'm Jim Coventry along with Antony Servino of RotoWire.
Jim, the first wide receiver I dislike going into redraft fantasy football in 2024, Cooper Kupp, Los Angeles Rams. And right now, Cooper Kupp, this is a player we're starting to see rise in terms of ADP. Right now, wide receiver 13 off the board. He was a little bit cheaper a month or so ago. So when we look at Cooper Kupp and the Los Angeles Rams offense, it is extremely Matthew Stafford dependent. That is one red flag. The health of Matthew Stafford. He managed to stay healthy last year, but if Matthew Stafford was to go down this year, all of the fantasy assets are going to go down with him. Speaking of injury concerns, Cooper Kupp, last year, only 12 games played. 2022, only 9 games played. Cooper Kupp is entering his age 31 season, but he seems like an older age 31 type of player. Let's factor in Puka Nacua, seems like a rising star in this offense and already has a great rapport with Matthew Stafford. Kyren Williams was a sensational running back last year. I believe he continues to see a lot of the workload. They also brought in Blake Corum, and they're also pretty deep at wide receiver. When we look at somebody like Tutu Atwell, he's a nice playmaker. He's listed as the 4 in this offense right now, while Demarcus Robinson rejuvenated his career with this Sean McVay offense. So how much volume will there be for Cooper Kupp? Down the stretch last year, when Cooper Kupp was healthy, he wasn't exactly getting the old Cooper Kupp volume. Some of that was going in the direction of Puka Nacua. In fact, if we look at some of the weeks down the stretch, he had fewer than 8 targets in 3 out of his final 5 games, not including the playoffs. When it's all said and done, there is way too many red flags for me to draft Cooper Kupp as the 13th wide receiver off the board.
The first receiver I dislike in 2024 redraft leagues is Stefon Diggs of the Houston Texans. Now, Stefon Diggs has been a great player for a long time. He's turning 30 years old. We also see he goes from Buffalo, where he averaged 159 targets per season. Yet in the last 3 years, Diggs only had 1 dominant year. The other 2 years were good, but they weren't dominant. Well, if you're going to go from 159 targets to an offense where Nico Collins led with 109 last year, and Diggs, in my mind, is the clear number 2-ish. Maybe he's with Tank Dell, but Collins is the number 1. And Diggs, you're going to see those targets go from 159 a season, probably close to 100. Well, that's a third of the potential targets or more gone. And if Diggs was only putting up 11 and 1,200 yards at 2 of the last 3 seasons, what is he going to do with far less target volume? And the answer is far less for an aging receiver learning a new offense. Problematic. So that said, Diggs is a very good player. Not questioning that. I think it's going to be very tough for Diggs to reach the 1,000-yard mark on the level of targets he's going to get in this offense. That said, people are drafting him as if he'll be a 1,200-yard receiver, and I don't see that happening.
Jim, the next receiver I dislike going into redraft season, Mike Evans, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Last year, Mike Evans was a fantasy football league winner when it comes to where we drafted him and his fantasy football finish. He was a wide receiver 7 and the wide receiver 10 in points per game. This year, we have to pay up to get Mike Evans, and that scares me a little bit. He's another aging receiver entering his age 31 season. Not a lot of injury concerns. In fact, he hasn't missed a lot of time since the 2019 season, in which he missed 3 games. But he is getting older. There's also the fact that there's a new offensive coordinator when Dave Canales is now the head coach of the Carolina Panthers. How will that affect Baker Mayfield? We also have to factor in Chris Godwin. All the reports are suggesting that Chris Godwin's going to be back in his natural position, lining up as a slot receiver, where he was more dominant for the better part of his career. Last year, Mike Evans, outstanding deep ball receiver. His bread and butter was the big play. He was number 1 in deep targets and cashed in on some of those deep targets with the second most touchdowns of any wide receiver with 13. Can all of that efficiency be maintained with Baker Mayfield? I'm going to err on the side of no, because we've never really seen a consistent version of Baker Mayfield. And if we get a lesser version of the quarterback we saw last year, I think Evans is closer to busting at his current ADP.
If you enjoy videos like this, please consider hitting the like button and subscribe to the RotoWire Fantasy Football channel on YouTube. Also, check out all of our fantasy football content and rankings by getting a free 2-day trial with no credit card needed. You just go to rotowire.com/Jim to see all of our content. The next receiver I dislike in 2024 fantasy redraft leagues is Calvin Ridley of the Tennessee Titans. Now, Ridley is going to be 30 in December, so he's getting near that mark. The other thing is, Ridley has one season with more than 1,016 yards. The question all along was, when he played well the one great season he had many years ago, Julio Jones is the number one. Ridley was often seeing light coverage, downfield options. In the new offense he's in, DeAndre Hopkins is being drafted after Ridley. I don't see a world where Hopkins is not leading in targets. Far more reliable of a player, even an aging Hopkins. The other thing is this. Ridley had 9 single-digit PPR point games with Trevor Lawrence. Now he has Will Levis. Will Levis may be a good quarterback. He had a great first game last year, but he was not a good quarterback after it. Okay, blame the system, blame the weapons, fine. But now they're bringing in a new coaching staff. The quarterback and the receivers, they have to learn a new system. That's not easy. The other thing is Will Levis good? The next point, can Will Levis support 2 fantasy relevant receivers? My guess is probably not. If you guess yes, that's fine. My thought is no. Ridley had 136 targets to get to 1,016 yards last year. The odds of him getting 136 targets or anything close in this offense seems remote. 100, maybe, not 136. Ridley's not being drafted overly aggressively, but he's being drafted with a relevant pick. And for me, there are plenty of other players with higher floor and a higher ceiling, and that puts me out on Calvin Ridley.
Jim, the next receiver I dislike going into 2024 redraft leagues, Malik Nabers, New York Giants. And right now, Nabers is going as a 19th receiver off the board. I want to put some things into perspective. Marvin Harrison Jr., highly touted talent, viewed as possibly the best receiver in this class. It's arguable, but I think he's the best receiver in this class. And Harrison, he's going as a fringe first-round pick, and I believe he's going a little bit overvalued for a rookie receiver we've never seen play down in the NFL. Now we look at Nabers going as the wide receiver 19. Well, what's the difference between these two players? The quarterback. So if I think Harrison is going overvalued, and he's tied to Kyler Murray, who we know can play and support a top-end fantasy receiver. How can I think that it is okay to draft Malik Nabers this high with Daniel Jones, and if it's not Daniel Jones at some point, Drew Lock under center? We know both of these quarterbacks, they're inefficient. They're not the most accurate throwers in the world, and I know Brian Dable can get the best out of his quarterbacks, but I think we've seen enough out of Daniel Jones. So far in camp, Malik Nabers, he has highlight reel after highlight reel catch. But this is training camp. This isn't for real. Let's see Nabers in real game action. And more notably, let's see Daniel Jones in real game action with pressure in his face. And let's see how good those balls are going to Nabers, which is one of the biggest issues I have. Even if Nabers draws 140 to 160 targets, there is no guarantee he gets very far with them. And the comp that I've made more times than not, Garrett Wilson, his first 2 years in the NFL, Garrett Wilson has had at least 147 targets, $168 last year, and he has yet to break the top 30 in fantasy points per game. And that's because of poor quarterback play and poor quality of target. And that's the issue I have with drafting Nabers this high.
The last receiver I dislike in 2024 redraft leagues is Tyler Lockett of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, look, Lockett had good yardage last year, 894 yards. And so overall, it looks good, right? But what we had the problem was yards after the catch, 16th percentile. Lockett's going to be 32 early this season. That's a problem. He's a declining player. And what we saw was to get to that 894 yards and 5 touchdowns, Lockett needed 122 targets, which is the second most of his career. It was the worst season overall that Lockett had since 2017. The next problem is this. Lockett's not going to be force-fed targets anymore. Pete Carroll's gone. Veteran deference not going to be there anymore. Jackson Smith and Jigba is there along with DK Metcalf. Metcalf is a star of sorts. Smith and Jigba was a first-round draft pick who was misused last year, but will certainly under new coach Ryan Grubb be used much more efficiently. They're going to use the young star on the rise as opposed to the former star on the fall. That means we are not going to see those 122 targets. We might see 85 targets. We might see 90. That's still a decent number, but Lockett on the decline. We could see if there's any type of nicked up injury, any problem. The time of recovery for aging players, in my mind, is always problematic. There are just too many factors working against Lockett. Another one, Geno Smith had that career year 2 years ago. Last year, he went a little bit downward. Now they have a new coach in town. If the magic isn't there for Geno Smith, there's another problem there. I just think overall, Lockett's going to be really tough to fit inside the top 48 receivers. So he's a player I'm avoiding in drafts.